For a lot of us, there are events and things that we encounter the older we get, at midlife and beyond, that we probably never really were prepared for. Maybe divorce, being an empty nester, maybe a major career change or pivot. But I can guarantee you that caring for your older parent, being a caregiver for mom or dad or someone who's in poor health, that probably wasn't on a lot of your bingo cards. And yet, over 50% of people who are either older millennials or most of Gen X find themselves in a position where they are a caregiver. Now, the past few episodes on Advanced Adulting, we focused a lot on taking care of mom and dad. We've talked to a lot of experts and learned about resources and ways that you can care for your parents. But what we haven't talked about is the burden of being a caregiver, of what it does to you and me and to our relationships, our career, our finances. Yeah, we want to take care of mom and dad or our loved one. But what about us? Who's going to care for the caregiver? That's what we're going to focus on today on the Advanced Adulting podcast. My guest is Jennifer Levin. Jennifer is the author of a new book called Generation Care, and she's also the founder of the Caregiver Collective, one of the largest online support groups geared for caregivers. And caregivers of all kinds, not just your aging parents, but people going through a significant illness and more. Jennifer's book is fantastic, but it's a rough read. And this is a rough conversation, but is one that is so valuable, so insightful, and so needed. And you're going to get something out of it if you or someone you love or know is in a situation of caregiver. We're going to talk about the identity that you go through of caring for someone else. We're going to talk about the stressors, the emotional, the physical, the mental side, what you can do to take care of you. We're going to talk about the role reversal when you have to parent the parent. We're going to talk about communication with your spouse, with your siblings, maybe the inequities that go on. This episode is all about you, the caregiver. Let's get to it in our conversation with Jennifer Levin. I'm Bradley Richardson, and this is Advanced Adulting. Jennifer Levin, welcome to Advanced Adulting.
Hi, thank you.
I'm so happy you're here. This is going to be a good conversation for anybody popping in because this is a topic that impacts so many people, but nobody really talks about it at all. And that is this idea of caregiving. I tell you what, I'll fanboy out for a second, but when reading your book, your new book, what I remember just the other day, I'm talking to Shannon here. I said, this book is so good. I said, this is so unbelievably good, but it is rough. It is a tough read. And you did such a great job with the storytelling of it, but the subject matter. My mother has passed. This is one of the most real, relatable, authentic perspectives of caregiving for a loved one or elder person that I've seen. So congratulations on that.
Thank you for that. That's very important to hear. And that's obviously what I wanted to strive, is not to sugarcoat, but to give the real portrayal of what we live. And so I appreciate that feedback.
Well, you nailed it. You definitely nailed it. And that's, again, I'm kind of, I don't want to bury the lead on that. So anybody here, we're going to talk about this particular book, but there's so many things. Now, what's interesting is it's Generation Care, and you come at it from a millennial perspective. Mm-hmm. But what's funny is this impacts everybody. It really doesn't matter. I mean, and I think you put in the book there, you are on the geriatric side of millennial. I'm on the geriatric side of, sorry. That's right. I didn't name ages, but I'm an older Xer. Okay. You're an older millennial. And what's funny is that, advanced adulting is helping grown-ass adults navigate midlife and beyond. And the oldest millennials are now squarely in midlife. And the thing that no one talks about, it's all these unexpected things. So you don't plan in your 20s. Hey, I wonder what my second marriage is going to be like. Hey, I wonder what it's going to be like to be an empty nester. And you sure as hell don't plan on what it's going to be like to care for my older parents in their decline. Mm-hmm. Why is it that we don't talk about this thing? I mean, it's so common amongst everybody.
It's so common. I think there are a few different reasons why we don't talk about it. I would say that as a culture, we do talk about it a bit more now in our society, the issue of family caregiving and the concept around it. Because, I mean, growing up, I always had this image of a caregiver as somebody who is a much older, probably retiree woman caring for real geriatrics, a geriatric parent or maybe an aging spouse. And that's, the model that we were shown. And so exactly, you kind of push it off thinking later, not me. And you're dealing with something that's incredibly difficult. It's the chronic illness or aging or disability of somebody that you love, not easy stuff to talk about. I think that often we put this idea of chronic illness or disease and vulnerability into
Hmm.
this drawer that we often don't want to look at. Unfortunately,
Right.
there's nothing shameful about it, but we do sometimes attach that stigma to it. And particularly as a caregiver, you're very attuned to wanting to preserve the dignity of your family member or whomever it is that you're caregiving for. And I think then
Hmm.
when you have amongst the millennial generation or maybe younger Gen Xers, or if you are Gen X and you started caregiving at a younger age. Because in this book,
Hmm.
I also interview caregivers who somewhat have been caregiving their entire lives. It's not
Right.
necessarily an aging parent, but it's somebody with mental illness
Yeah.
or chronic disease. And this spans for decades. So I think also when you're younger and you don't have that model of somebody else who's your age, a peer who's caregiving, then you don't talk about it because you think that nobody will understand. You don't want to be met with a closed door in your face emotionally. And then that silence perpetuates, right? So we don't talk to each other about it. And then in turn, in society, we don't talk about it. And it goes as this kind of hidden phenomenon. And there's no
Hmm.
reason for that.
Well, it's funny. I mean, you look at, look, I'm not a sociologist here, but you look at how throughout the generations, how it's changed. And so much of it is because we are so spread out, so disconnected. Now, I know I was probably the last one where I lived in the same city as my great grandmother. And everybody had this proximity. Everybody kind of cared for, whether by default, it wasn't really something that you thought about. It just happened, that the generations interacted and cared for. And now with everybody distributed all over, I mean, like I've got 3 grown kids. They live all over. You've got divorce, which you probably didn't have as much, a couple generations ago. And so it's tough to really pinpoint who's going to care for people who need care and have always gotten it in some form or fashion. You just don't have it anymore, don't have access to it.
Yeah, the way that we live, as you're saying, looks very different now. And, you have people who work abroad. That didn't
Hmm.
exist at the same levels for our
Right.
parents' generation. But what I've also seen in interviewing younger caregivers is that sometimes they don't even have the opportunity to move away. That they start
Hmm.
caregiving maybe right out of college, or maybe were already caregiving when they entered college. And it
Hmm.
really dictated and continues to dictate where people live. So for me,
Yeah.
I was a long distance caregiver. I was living in Los Angeles. My family was in New York City. And, as we all spread out, we also, I think, treat transportation in our country a little bit differently than decades ago, where I could
Hmm.
get on a plane last minute and it could cost an arm and a leg, but if it was an emergency, it was an emergency. Whereas, yeah, there are other caregivers who the majority live within miles of the person that they care for. And so really construct their adult lives around that.
It's funny, we use this term sandwich generation, and I know that anybody who is, familiar with that term, I think a lot, at least as an extra in my 50s, you think of it as, hey, caring for an older parent or person
Mhm.
and that child who's just starting to launch, oftentimes in your teens or 20s. But for the younger Xer or older millennial like yourself, or anybody really, as I've dove into this, I started to realize that definition has expanded out to you're caring for the elder person, but that other end, that other part of the sandwich is you may not have kids, but your own career, your own life, your own relationships,
Mhm.
everything is on hold, and you're fighting up against that. And really, it's hard to launch period or live your life.
That's the thing. When you begin caregiving at a younger age, you're still often in a process of identity building for yourself. As you mentioned,
Hmm.
like when I began caregiving, really the center of my attention was my career. And then when I wasn't working ridiculous hours, I was with my friends. It was like
Right.
one or the other. And there wasn't really much space beyond that. And, if you're, let's say, 30, early 30s, you're in a place where you're building, capital, like social capital, financial capital. You're starting to
Right.
you've been working long enough that you're hopefully graduating into, making a little bit more money, having a little bit more respect at work, although that is pushed off more and more, I think, as our society has evolved. But absolutely, that's a really interesting way of phrasing it. What you said is that instead of maybe raising a child, you're still raising yourself in a lot of ways.
Sure. Well, you are. You're caught in the middle, and whether it's caught in the middle from your future or a child or anything, and I think that's the thing. You mentioned this about identity for a second. I think I want to talk about kind of the definition of caregiving. One thing that I took from your book was how we are so reluctant to identify or be self-aware enough to consider ourselves caregivers. It's almost there's a stigma that, yeah, I'm caregiving, but there's a burden, whether you accept it lovingly, begrudgingly, whatever, that's still a burden, but we don't want to label ourselves that. We thought of and I think we started off this conversation, we thought of a caregiver as someone who's a trained professional. You're a home health, you're in a hospital or something like that. It's not, hey, part of my definition of how I see myself now is as a caregiver. Let's talk about that and kind of why it's so important that you acknowledge and embrace that.
Mm-hmm. I think that, well, first of all, right, this reluctance we have, it's either we're naive to what a caregiver is, as you mentioned, or we're reluctant to apply that title to ourselves. And that comes from a lot of different reasons that I've read about and that I've written about. One is that we don't want to over-identify with that role. So we just don't mention it at all. We'd rather be known as a writer or as a lawyer or a mother or a spouse and don't want to over-identify, so choose not to identify. There are other people who just don't like the word caregiver. They think it sounds very clinical. Mm-hmm. And what they're doing is they are a partner or they're a daughter. And so they just choose not to adopt that title or just naive as to what a caregiver is. Now, it's important to identify yourself as a caregiver, particularly at a younger age, I think, because again, we don't have the modeling so much of somebody our age going through it, which is another piece of the pie of why people don't take the title for themselves. But it's important because there's a study, which if I tried to give you a statistic right now, I would completely butcher. When people start referring to themselves as a caregiver, how much more access they grant themselves to available resources and to support. So when you don't identify as a caregiver and you're just dealing with illness or disease or aging, you are kind of blindly Googling stuff. And you may not even realize that there are supports out there for you. When you begin Googling caregiver, suddenly your pages fill up with different support groups, with different resources, right, with different respite programs. So, and grants, financial assistance. So, that's a huge reason to identify as a caregiver is what you can just find for yourself online, even in terms of resources and support, but also in terms of relating to other caregivers. Now you have a group that you can look to mirror back to you your own experience, whether it's through a support group, whether you're identifying yourself as a caregiver in a discussion with somebody and they say, oh, I am too. It allows people also a little peek into what are your responsibilities at home that people may not have access to from Instagram or from your job title.
There's a couple of things with that. I want to talk about Instagram in a second, but it's so funny when you get in these conversations with somebody that I guess it will dovetail into Instagram. Everyone has this perfect curated life online. And again, back to millennials, y'all have gotten such a bad rap on, hey, you live in mom's basement or on Xbox and everybody's beautiful and living in Miami. And you realize that there's so much more that when you actually have the conversations, I know with my peer group, it's one of those of, hey, why did you move? Or, you're an empty nester. What are y'all doing now? Well, I'm taking care of my father-in-law, or I'm taking care of this. And there's so many people, regardless of education, income, culture, that do this. And it is that dirty little secret that when you really open it up, so many of us have to deal with that. And it's not just the beautiful piece of look at my beautiful curated life. These are real decisions that oftentimes we're putting our identity around.
Absolutely. And to be honest, it doesn't even take that much opening up to get somebody to respond to it who's also a caregiver. If you really just say, I'm a caregiver for my father or my mother or whomever, or I have to get home because the nurse's aide is only with my spouse until 7 p.m. and I have to be there.
Right.
Often when you say that to somebody, if they're a caregiver themselves, which statistically they might be, very quickly you'll notice people start to match your story with their own and say, oh, I'm a caregiver to whomever. I know exactly what you're talking about. I deal with this too. And that's really how the dialogue gets started.
Well, and it needs to be a dialogue. And again, that's one of the things I think is so great about the community that you started and in the book as well, because there's a lot that this is kind of one of the, I consider the oh shit problems. It's the 911 shit. What do we do? You know that it's coming. And I use my own, life as an example of this. I mean, my mom was living back in West Texas. I was in Dallas. My sister's in Atlanta. And we knew that there was going to be, that day was coming. We knew. But we didn't talk about it. We talked loosely about it. We didn't want to admit it. And then suddenly she falls in the shower and 3 people's lives change. It's a trickle down because her kids, my kids, her husband, everything. And I think that there is a lot of good information. And we've done some of this on these podcasts of providing resources and awareness for how you can care for your mom or dad or loved one. But what I love so much about your work is the burden that falls on us, the ones who are doing it. And is that acknowledging? And I think half the battle is probably, man, I'm not the only one. Wow. Okay. I didn't know that. I'm seen, I'm heard. I get this. Just that I think there's got to be some comfort in the commonality of it all.
Definitely. I've had this group now, Caregiver Collective. I think I began it 8 years ago. And 8 years in, we still have people that join who, when they do, will post something online saying, I'm a caregiver for my uncle who has Parkinson's. I've never said this out loud before. I've never admitted to anybody that I'm going through this. I've never met anybody who's doing this at my age. I'm so relieved to be here.
Right.
Regularly, people post that and just say, or maybe a week later, they post, I just joined the group and I've been reading all of the posts already. I feel better. That's exactly it. That when you have somebody who you feel like is in the boat with you, even if it's a different family, it's a different circumstance, it lifts such a weight. And just to say out loud, this is what I'm going through.
Hey, we'll get back to this in just a second. But first, do you have older parents? Whether you care for them across town or across the country, you need to know about Jubilee TV. It's a great way to be able to stay in touch with your mom or dad, to help them out with any crazy technology and remote issues, but also is a great way to keep track of them and to communicate with them through your TV, regardless of location. Look, it's another way to show that you care and to give them and you some peace of mind. Check them out at Get Jubilee TV and use code ADULTING at checkout for $25 off. It's definitely worth it, and we're happy to have them as a sponsor of Advanced Adulting and the Advanced Adulting podcast. Now, let's get back to it. Let's talk for a second about kind of the word you used in the book was role ambiguity. And I get that because, you're one of the things I talk about in Advanced Adulting is, this idea of you find there's a tipping point. Whether it is a life event, whether it's you having children, you getting a divorce, you screwing something up on your own, you realize, wow, my parents were right when they said, just you wait till you become my age. and they're right. And I think that, when I read this about the role ambiguity, we look at our parents and we hold them, I don't want to say, revere or self-esteem. It could be a good relationship, bad relationship, but we look at them in a certain role. And then when we finally realize, oh, damn, you're human. You're scared. You're going through this. Okay. You are fallible. You're all of this, and you're having to step up. That sucks. That's a hard thing that nothing prepares you for. So let's talk a little bit about that, because I know you've experienced it, and I know the people in your community have experienced that as well.
I would say that just what you're talking about right now, I know which part of the book you're referencing, and it was one of the hardest parts to write. Just seeing my father as vulnerable when my entire life he had been my protector. And now I saw him as someone who could be injured, who dealing with his own emotional process of having a disease. You start to realize this vulnerability and that your parents are human. And that was painful. It's natural, but it's painful. So the role ambiguity, there's role ambiguity. Just to back up for a second, is this idea that, I'm the caregiver to my father, but I'm still his daughter. So, all of these different roles. I'm also his friend. all of these different roles start getting coupled on top of each other. And how do we kind
Hmm.
of pull the threads apart so that being a daughter doesn't only mean being his caregiver, that we still have the father-daughter relationship? Or
Right.
role ambiguity also transfers onto the other people in your life, your friend. If you're dealing with a lot of responsibilities as a caregiver, your friend starts to realize maybe I can't go to you the same way I always could. You may not be as available to me. And that relationship gets a little warped as well. And so there's role ambiguity there of who are you to me now while you're dealing with
Hmm.
this. So I'm sorry, what was the original question?
No, no. I think that's something though that's just important to acknowledge, and there's no end result. It's more of the awareness of that, and how do some people deal with that. And I think you hit on that. It's realizing that hey, it's you can be both, but it becomes much more fluid.
Absolutely. And I think it's important. It's obviously going to become fluid. You can't really get around that. But at the same time, it's important to find distinction where you can so that you are spending quality time with that person as you
Sure.
would if the caregiving experience didn't exist. And granted, it'll
Well,
look different, but try
yeah.
to preserve what you can.
I think one of the hard things, and some of the other conversations I've had on this podcast have been more on the service side, on the provider side, and people who are doing great things on helping our parents and loved ones be safe or maintain independence. And I think that it really does, have some overlap though, because that there's a lot of pride involved. Okay,
Mhm.
a lot of pride. I mean, how are you doing, Mom? I'm fine. Okay, well, no, you're not. You're just not going to tell me. You're not going to tell me shit. Or that reluctance to tell you to do anything, to that embarrassment, and to be able to recognize that they still see themselves oftentimes. You don't baby me, don't treat me like a baby. I want to having them keep that independence and that pride. Sometimes when they're being a child, you know what's best for them and you know what you need to do, but you still have that respect. That's a difficult thing.
Absolutely. That's the role reversal of that is for both parties, as you said. It's you, whether you're, like in the case of an adult child and the parent, of having to assume responsibility for them, whether that's helping them eat or things that you associate with helping a child do, or it's for me being my dad's healthcare proxy, deciding where he
Right.
was going to live, doing all of that on his behalf.
Hmm.
And then exactly that, there's their own role reversal of not wanting to, lose pride even in front of their own family and also for
Sure.
themselves. It's this stuff is not easy. It is
No,
not.
no, it's so funny because I mean, again, what I do with advanced adults, I cover a variety of subjects. So sometimes we'll talk about careers, we'll talk about relationships, we're talking about this. I mean, the much like I was gutted reading your book because it hit home and it really related. The comments you'll get, because everybody's like, "Oh yeah, I'm going through it now, and here it is." One thing that I want to, there is no easy solution. I think that's the one thing that I discovered, and I'm sure you and your people in your community do. There's no one, I gotta. If there were, geez, I mean, it'd be great to just flip a switch and hey, this is what you do. Here's a 2-step formula.
Mhm.
It's not, and it's unique to every particular person and situation. There are some other things that I want us to talk about, but I think one thing that's important for anybody watching this and reading your book is, look, we can talk a problem to death and we can acknowledge it, and it's important to do that, but it's also important to talk about a solution and what you can do for it as well. Because otherwise it becomes this, giant bitch session of, oh yeah, well that sucks. It does. Yeah, it does. What are we gonna do about it? Um, let's talk a little bit about self care, okay? Because I think I loved how you put it. It was like it's not a bath bomb. Okay, this is not a day at the spa. Okay,
Mhm.
I'm good. Hey, I had an afternoon massage. I'm ready to roll. Yeah, I'm good. It's all good. And I think it's easy, by well-meaning other people, well-meaning friends and others. Oh, just take care of yourself. Great. There's no shut off on this. It's not that different than having a 2-year-old. Okay, I can't just say, hey, go play on the street. Okay, it's okay. And what have you found are some real solutions to this type of thing of at least keeping your sanity, keeping you from breaking down somehow while you're going through this?
Yeah. Well, I want to also just add to what you said is that it's right, like raising a 2-year-old, there's no shut off, but it's also such a heightened experience where people are always having this sense of waiting for the other shoe to drop, that your
Yeah.
nervous system is wrecked.
Oh
So
God.
it's not just keeping eyes on everything at all times, but you're doing that from a very heightened sense and state of being. that is not behaviorally healthy. It is
No.
a healthy mental state to be so activated all the time.
Yeah, my sister, what my sister would call, it's like if she called certain early in the morning or late at night, I'm like, oh shit.
Mhm.
You just know what is it, what's going to happen. Yeah,
Yep.
you're right. You're heightened. So what are some ways that what can you do for yourself on this?
For yourself, I would say that, right, we get these well meaning platitudes often of take care of yourself, go sit alone in a room, eat a piece of chocolate, all of these things. And I do spend a couple pages in the book shitting on those ideas, I'll be honest. Um, and
Sounds great. Yeah.
but at the same time, I do have to pay them merit that it is shown that these small acts that you do for yourself do help build resilience. And resilience at the end of the day is what is going to get you through this experience. So these little things, these moments to take for yourself are important, but they are not a solution. Absolutely not. So, what can you do for yourself? I would say that in all of the caregivers that I interviewed, the ones that had taken very positive steps for their own well being without neglecting their care responsibilities,
Mhm.
they made those decisions with the help of a therapist. So,
Excellent.
not only is a therapist and having some sort of behavioral health treatment helping you as far as bringing down your nervous system, however that looks for you, whether it's somatic therapy or encouraging you to exercise or just talk therapy, whatever your therapist encourages with you, but it's also giving you an objective third party who doesn't only have the person receiving care in mind when making
Right.
decisions. It isn't
Hmm.
or isn't your best friend who's only going to look at your perspective, but
Right.
an objective third party to really help you work through decisions that can help you and preserve your identity, preserve your well-being as best you can.
Well, I think I love that idea. And Frank, it's so obvious, but one that I hadn't thought of or I really don't see put out there that often. And let's talk about that for a second. Let's talk about the range of feelings and emotions. Okay. Because again, the unpopular thing, there's a shitload of resentment. There's some fear. There's some resentment of, hey, I'm having to put my life on hold. Hey, this is costing me a ton. Hey, all of those issues that, I guess it's, again, I'm no therapist on this, but hey, look, the more you bury the shit, the more you put it down, that's just bad all the way around. You're gonna lash out someone, whether it's the one you're caring for, your kids, work, whatever. I mean, just kind of sitting with it and going, yeah, I am mad about this,
Mhm.
or I'm sad, I'm whatever. What are your thoughts, or what do you see from in that area?
Absolutely. I mean, exactly. Labeling your emotions, pulling them apart from each other so you can understand what you're truly feeling. I write about this in the book. Anger was a go-to emotion for me. I wasn't angry at my dad. I wasn't angry at anything in particular, but I
Right.
had crazy road rage at that time. I
Oh
had
yeah.
control issues. If a cab was late to pick us up, different things that it was all masking the fear that I was experiencing regularly and the sadness and just that lack of control at watching my father get worse. But I wasn't aware of it at the time. I wasn't aware
Yeah.
that that's why I have road rage. And so I think labeling these emotions, really untangling them from each other and understanding what you're going through already provides some reprieve. And then you can think to yourself, or with the help of a therapist, well, how do I tackle this? For things like anger, there's physical things you could do,
Yeah.
kickboxing, push a wall. My
Right.
therapist tells me this often. If you just push against a wall, it does the thing that she's explained to me in your brain, that it does help relieve your stress. So there are these techniques that exist to help us. And also, so labeling it and then also being able to express it and
Right.
then, right, take actionable steps to help yourself so that you don't erupt in the way that you're saying. Because by the way, that eruption, I mean, it also really affects your physical health. It's not just your mental
Oh God,
health.
yeah.
But the amount of times you find yourself getting sick, because
Yep.
you're stressed and all of these different things.
I don't remember what it was. It was Neil. I think it was Neil Shaw who we had on a few weeks ago. He was talking about, and I forget the stat, but it was alarming that likelihood, the percentage of likelihood of the caregiver getting sick or dying before the one
Mm.
they're caring for sometimes is just astronomical. I mean, it's these burdens that we never expected. And I like how you talked about this, the labeling and communicating. But let's talk about other relationships for a second, okay?
Mm.
Because you know there are people in your life, friends, spouses, partners, all of that, that are going through it with you, but it may not be, you may be the one dealing with it. Okay. Um, let's talk about the communication with them for a minute. I know you have some things in the book that are fantastic about dealing with this, caring for a spouse and caring for other siblings and loved ones. But how do you maintain your relationship when you're coming apart inside?
That's a very good question. And I think that's what a lot of caregivers, particularly younger caregivers who your social scene is still such a large part of your life, it's what they really grapple with. And I would say that one, it's being as open with your experience caregiving as you can with them, letting people
Hmm.
in, because like I mentioned, we often don't talk about it. I had friends who knew my dad had a disease. They knew that I was dealing with particular things and that I'd have to fly home to visit him, and that other times I chose to fly home to visit him. But I had a lot of people in my life, and definitely work colleagues, who had no idea that that was going on.
Hmm.
It was when I first wrote about it that I had
Right.
friends contact me and said, I had no idea. So I would say it's a matter of being open as you can. And there are a lot of reasons that people are not open about their experience, whether it's a perceived sense of shame, trying to preserve the care recipient's dignity, not wanting to share certain details, or sometimes we have like a familial behavioral pattern that is, don't talk about the family outside of the house.
Right.
And you've been conditioned growing up that way, and so it feels like a betrayal to talk about it with somebody. And so I would say figure out how you feel comfortable disclosing this to other people, what you feel comfortable sharing, and with whom, and who you think will be receptive to it. In the case of friendships outside of your home, I'm talking about, or
Hmm.
colleagues. And then share and see what that response is like. You may not be met with the response that you hope for. You may be
Hmm.
met with more, but at least let people understand why you may have to cancel plans last minute.
Right.
It's not personal. You're not flaky, but there's something very serious going on. When it comes to a spouse, that's a whole other can of worms, or a partner.
Right.
There are a lot of these instances where people seem to be on separate pages that I've interviewed, who are partnered and find themselves caring or about to care for a parent, let's say, or sometimes a sibling. And they may want to move the person into the home with them. The spouse thinks absolutely not.
Right.
So you have a discrepancy there, right? The advice that was given by Dr. Lisa Paz, who's interviewed in the book, is to, if you're comfortable with it, if you need kind of assistance with communication, to again work with a therapist or an objective third party who can help you navigate those discussions so that they don't explode into fights, and they don't, you used the word resentment earlier for yourself, but I think sometimes when you're sharing a life experience with somebody and you two are on separate pages of how to handle
Right.
caregiving, there's a lot of resentment that can build there, and it can build very fast. You don't want to erupt relationships over this if you can prevent that.
There's another relationship we haven't talked about, but for many people is critical, and there can be a lot of resentment. Is that sibling relationship, because you have that family member inevitably. It would be great if it were equally distributed, but inevitably one person's probably going to take more of a burden than another, whether it is time, effort, living, financial, whatever. Yeah, let's talk about that for a second. About whether is there a best way to navigate it, or how do you navigate it when y'all aren't on the same page?
Right. Is there a best way to navigate it? I think is so complicated because everybody's family and sibling situation is different, right?
Right.
So you do have, as you mentioned, with siblings, it is most often statistically that one sibling takes on the majority of the caregiving, what we call caregiving burden, which people interviewed, most people don't like that word, but for the as means of describing it. So in that case, often, as you said, a lot of resentment really builds up, especially when you can try and pull in those siblings to be on the same page as you, kind of
Mhm.
shake them a little bit. Look what's happening. Look what this person is going through. And I need help. It's twofold. It's like, one, let's acknowledge the condition of this person, which sometimes people don't even want to do. They're in denial, which is why sometimes
Right.
a lot of people, as long as somebody else is handling it, will shirk it off. And also, I need help. I cannot do this all alone. We also have other instances of siblings who all want to be involved, and everybody has a different relationship to the person receiving care.
Right.
Everybody has a different relationship to each other, and everybody has a different idea that they are certain is the best way that this should happen. And so, how do you deal with that situation?
Right.
And I would say that in that case of too many cooks in the kitchen, I have not lived this. I'm an only child, but from experts that I have asked their opinion is, again, bring in a third party, bring in
Yeah.
someone objective who's not directly involved in this situation, who can kind of relieve the pressure of relaying information and also make sure it stays respectful and make sure that everybody is hearing what's actually being said. Sometimes
Yeah.
somebody, especially a sibling you have a very historied relationship with, talks
Mhm.
and they say one thing and you hear something else because
That's
of
totally different.
all of your history. And so
Well,
having another person can really help clear that up.
that history is so huge, and you can't ignore that because there's history. I mean, look, I mean, that's a therapist's dream right there of all the history of, siblings. Hey, you were shitty to me when I was 12 and this, or your history, one child's history with the parent. I've seen things of, hey, well, let that son of a bitch rot. I'm fine. I mean, it's just,
Yeah.
there's so it's not just dealing with what's in the present moment and what's ahead of you. You still have this 30, 40, 50 years of resentment and baggage and things to deal with as well. So you're right. Bringing in a third party is a genius move.
And it's also, I have to say that what you're talking about also exists sometimes, even when there aren't siblings involved, but there are some people in my group who are caregivers for parents that were abusive when they were young,
Right.
or whether it was to them or to another parent, or who have a history of alcoholism. And so then that resentment really exists towards the person receiving care. But these caregivers step in anyway and say, I'll do this. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's another emotional morass that has to be traversed. Again, I'm the hugest proponent of therapy. Maybe it's because I'm from New York, so we're putting
Right.
therapy at kindergarten, or my mother's the therapist. I don't know, but
Right.
I just think it helps just navigate so much.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, this is just for anybody. I mean, look. I mean, I grew up in Texas. You're New York. I mean, it doesn't matter. I believe this. This is one of these advanced adulting issues that it really does. There's some nuances to it, based on your background, upbringing, all that. But for the most part, you're talking about something that affects everybody. It doesn't matter if you're from New York, Texas, California, your religion, your race, economics, education. Everyone's going to have to deal with that, so, at some point. And I think that's the great equalizer for a lot of us, and recognizing that's important. That's okay too.
Mhm.
Um, let's talk about long-term effects, and not on the parents, not on the one we're caring for, on us, right? Because, and especially, it impacts everybody, but especially you're talking about millennials here. You, at some point, that person's going to pass. At some point, you're not always going to be a caregiver.
Mhm.
Yet you've spent so much time, you've gone through all these things. What do you do afterwards? How do you kind of pick up the pieces? And the bigger question is, how do you think it's going to impact your view on longevity, or your view of when you're growing older?
I would say that, okay, first of all, how do you pick up the pieces? One thing that I really try to stress in this book is, how do you hold on to the pieces of your own identity outside of caregiving while you're living this experience? Because as
Perfect.
you said, you will not be a caregiver forever.
Mhm.
And what's left when that care situation is over? So there are people who, I have a section of this book that deals with grief. And there are
Mhm.
people who feel real grief at the loss of the caregiver role because they don't know what to do with themselves anymore.
Hmm.
How do I provide my value? I have all this love. Where does it go? I have all this information. Where does it go? And so I would say, how can you preserve your identity? And there are great tips in the book from a therapist on how to do this, how to prioritize places in your life that you can give attention to, and how do you do that? But
Hmm.
what are the different aspects of your identity before care, if you can
Right.
remember the time? Because as I said, some people start very young, or your own interests that maybe you want to cultivate further. Because when you start caregiving younger, as we mentioned earlier, you're still a lot of times in your life still identity building in a lot of ways. There's still things you want to try you haven't had the opportunity to do yet, as opposed to
Hmm.
caregivers who start when they're retired. So
Right.
how do you try to explore these different pieces of yourself outside of care? And when you think about that, it's not only identifying those pieces, but then, okay, I've identified, I really like music. Okay, how logistically can I keep that a part of my life? Well, in small
Hmm.
ways, while I'm doing the dishes, I can listen to music instead of having the news on, instead of zoning out, whatever, I can bring it in there. There's also, I really want to go to this concert. It's a
Hmm.
month away, 2 months away.
Hmm.
How can I have reliable home care for this person? Or if they're in an assisted living or a nursing facility, somebody to visit them that day that I can't be there,
Hmm.
so that I can take this evening to go to this concert as a special occasion. So
Right.
I would say at the end of the day, when caregiving is no longer present for you, you will have still been cultivating these other sides that you can lean into and fall back on to provide comfort at the beginning of a sense
Right.
of self, and then to continue to see through as you continue in your life.
Excellent. I mean, this is, as a caregiver, it is just another label, another chapter, another, layer to who you are in everything. And, one of the things I talk about with advanced adulting is, as you go through life, from your 20s and 30s, 40s and 50s and beyond, you are a totally different human being as this.
Mhm.
And sometimes, whether it's after the loss of a loved one, or you're no longer a caregiver, or divorce, or whatever, sometimes you have to realize, hey, who was I before that label? Who was I in the chapter before, and what can I pick up and
Mhm.
continue or leave behind, either way? But
Mhm.
you're right. I think that maintaining your sense of self is critical throughout. It's not something you just let go and then, hey, I'll get it again. It's, if you can keep it going, A plus. It's good.
And as a way to cope, while you're living the experience, not just to bank for later, but also so that you feel like a full 3D human being, which sometimes can be difficult when somebody else's
Mhm.
needs eclipse your own, frankly, a lot of times. And
Right.
so just being fuller within your own skin, it really helps with that as well.
Hey, tell us just for a little bit about the community. Okay. So obviously, I encourage anybody to go out and read the book, regardless of millennial X or whatever. It's fantastic. But the community itself, tell us a little bit about that, where people can go for a resource and how that's set up.
Sure. So I started this group, as I said, 8 years ago, because at that time, we weren't talking about caregiving. We really were not talking about young adults caregiving. And
Hmm.
at that point, there was just zero resources. There was nothing. There was no information. That there was no support groups. And people were going to support groups looking for a shoulder, looking for information, and a lot of times with ostracization because they were so much younger than anybody else there.
Hmm.
And so there was further isolation perceived after those experiences, and people really retreated into themselves a lot of times. Not always, but sometimes.
Right.
And so I created this group so that people our age have a place to go and meet each other. And one, meet other people who are your age in this situation. Two, we handle caregiving, frankly, different than older generations do. We grew up differently. We, grew up with the internet for the most
Hmm.
part. We are used to digitization and we expect it. And so we approach caregiving differently. And so, where can you meet others who are approaching it in a similar way so that you can share
Right.
resources? And I created this group online because I also recognized one, we're spread out all over the country, but two, as a caregiver, you may not be able to show up to a support group every Tuesday at 7 p.m.
Right.
All sorts of things come up. You can't really structure your time that way. And so having something available 24/7, you can go post there whenever, I think is so important because people post at all hours. People respond to posts from a year earlier.
Hmm.
because they just joined the group and they're going through this now. And so you're banking all of this information from thousands of caregivers your age. It's been such an inclusive community. It has been so positive. I know with other support groups I've seen, it kind of can turn into a bitch fest of
Right.
my life's so hard. No, my life's so hard.
Yeah.
This group has never once strayed in that direction, not because people aren't being honest, but because of how supportive it is. When people say, this is so hard, other people say, we see you, we get it. You're doing such a good job. I've
Yeah.
really never experienced like such a wonderful group of people who are really just looking out for each other and who have met offline as well.
Yeah.
So I'm really proud of the group and what it's become.
Good. Well, I encourage you. We'll put the links to everything below, and the notes so anybody can access that. But that's good stuff. So, what you got a lot coming up. What excites you the most right now? What's the most? It can be anything, personal, professional, whatever. What are you most excited about right now?
I'm most excited about this book being released. I mean, maybe that's the obvious answer, but I have been living with this information for such a long time and working on this book, researching, having lived it, having met caregivers through my group, having observed the trends. That was really one of the reasons I decided to write this book, is because I started recognizing very different situations of caregivers, but these emerging trends within people our age who are dealing with this at a younger age than expected. And
Mhm.
the obstacles you hit at the workplace when you're not in a seniority position, or, when you don't have finances saved because you haven't been working very long. I've just been living with this information for so long. I'm excited to share it. I'm excited to talk about it. I'm excited
Right.
for it to hopefully kind of open up the discussion of how we talk about caregiving in our country, and not just caregiving. It's a book about caregiving 100%. To me, this is a book about how our country lives. I mean, this is a book about what families look like. This is a book
Right.
about how we live, who we choose to live with, and what we're doing when we do. So while caregiving is the experience it's obviously rooted in and what it's about, this is a bigger reflection of all of us and how we treat our family and people we consider family.
Excellent. That's good stuff. Well, the book's fantastic, and I love the mission as well.
Oh,
This isn't just, and that's what I've been so encouraged by in this whole series and the conversations that I've had with you and others in the caregiving space is, yeah, is there a business opportunity? Is there a market? Sure. But very few people start out with it that way. It's something that's born out of a need. It's born out
mhm.
of their own life and serving others. And I love that and applaud that very, very much. So last question. So you have a time machine and you get to go back, 20 years and you're younger, you're starting out. You get to have coffee with yourself.
Mhm.
What advice would you give yourself about navigating this stage of life, knowing what you know now?
I would say I'm not somebody who lives with regrets, but I would say one thing about the caregiving experience, particularly, and dealing with that at that age is I had chutzpah. I wasn't afraid to talk, but there were some decisions that were made that felt wrong. And it is a family up against a company a lot of times. Pick your
Hmm.
company. It could be an insurance company, it could be, in my case, a nursing home, whatever, in which they tell you this is the way it's going to be. I would say push back as much as you can. If your gut says this is a bad idea, do
Hmm.
not let it happen. And I would say that I pushed back, but I wish I had done more.
Yeah, it's good. Jennifer Levin, new book, Generation Care, doing good stuff. Thanks for
Thank
being here.
you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been great talking to you.